You open your payslip, look at the hourly rate, and do that quiet maths in your head. Rent, groceries, debt. If this goes down even a little, I'm finished. Now, imagine there's no legal minimum. Your boss cuts your pay in half. Take it or leave, and the law does nothing. For most of history, that's exactly how it worked. The reason there's any floor under your pay today isn't kindness or economics. It's because other people already lived and died at the bottom, in sweatshops and strikes, until starvation wages finally became a crime, instead of just business as usual. For most workers in the year 1800s and early 1900s, there was no such thing as a minimum wage. The wage was whatever the owner could get away with, paying the poorest, most desperate person in line outside the factory gate. In big cities, that usually meant sweatshops, not the way the word gets used online today. Actual sweatshops, cramped apartments and lofts packed with sewing machines, bodies, and steam, windows nailed shut, oil lamps and gas lights burning through the night. Most of the people inside weren't unskilled teenagers. They were immigrant women, recent arrivals from places like Italy and Eastern Europe, paid by the piece how many shirtwaists or collars they could finish in a day. If orders were slow, the boss simply cut the rate per piece and your pay dropped even if your hours didn't. There was no law saying, below this line, it's exploitation. No hotline, no inspector. If you complained, you didn't get a performance review, you got replaced, because the city was full of people one step hungrier than you. In New York's garment district, some women worked 11 or 12 hours a day and still couldn't afford rent alone. They took in boarders, packed families into single rooms, or sent their children to work just to close the gap between wages and the cost of being alive. And when the doors locked from the outside and fire broke out, like at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911, low pay came bundled with something else. No safe exits. Even when workers pushed back, they were fighting naked, no wage floor under their feet. In 1909, around 20,000 mostly young Jewish and Italian women walked off the job in New York in what became known as the Uprising of the 20,000, demanding better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Police arrested them. Judges sneered that they should be home with their husbands, and employers signed only partial agreements because nothing in the law said their wages were unacceptably low. Minimum wage did not start as an abstract economic idea. It started as a simple, angry question from people trapped in rooms like these. How is this legal? So if no law stopped starvation wages, how did the first one even get written? The first wage floor wasn't built in America. It was built in desperation, by governments watching their economies about to explode from strikes. In the year 1890s, dock and shipping workers in places like New Zealand and Australia walked off the job over brutal hours and starvation pay. The answer wasn't just more police. Governments created special wage boards for the worst-paying industries. Half bosses, half workers, chaired by someone neutral with one radical job agree on the lowest legal wage in that trade, so firms competed on quality instead of who could grind workers down the furthest. This wasn't a universal floor yet. It was a patchwork, low-paid trades here, a handful of factories there, each with its own board and loopholes. But for the first time, the idea was on paper. There is a point where pay gets so low, the state has to step in and say, below this, it's not a job, it's exploitation. By the early 1900s, versions of these laws had spread. Wage boards in Britain, minimum wage rules for women in parts of the United States, always framed as protecting vulnerable workers, but tangled up with racism and sexism. Some reformers wanted to help the poorest. Others just wanted to price immigrants and people of color out of jobs. Minimum wage was being born, but it carried the fingerprints and prejudices of the societies that created it. So that's the idea. But in the United States, there was still no national floor until the economy collapsed. The Great Depression blew everything open. When a quarter of the workforce is unemployed, take it or leave it becomes take it or starve, and wages collapse. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal tried industry-by-industry codes, minimum wages and maximum hours so companies couldn't undercut each other by running sweatshops. But in the mid-1930s, the Supreme Court struck those codes down, saying the federal government had gone too far in telling businesses what to pay. And that should have been the end of it, except for one woman who refused to accept freedom of contract as an excuse to be robbed. Her name was Elsie Parrish. She was a chambermaid at a hotel in Washington state. She sued because her employer ignored the state's minimum wage law for women. The hotel argued that forcing them to pay her a minimum violated the Constitution. In 1937, the Supreme Court ruled for Parrish. It upheld the state minimum wage and said the Constitution does not guarantee a boss the right to pay whatever they want if the community decides there has to be a floor. That one decision cracked the legal wall that had blocked national wage laws for decades. Roosevelt moved fast. By 1938, after fierce fights in Congress, he signed the Fair Labor Standards Act. It banned the worst forms of child labor, capped the standard work week, and, for the first time, set a federal minimum wage. 25 cents an hour. 25 cents doesn't sound like much now. But in a world that had just learned how quickly wages can be driven towards zero, a nationwide floor, any floor, was a revolution. It meant that in at least some jobs, take it or leave it, finally had a legal bottom line, and paying below it wasn't just cruel, it was a crime. But here's the thing. Even after that victory, millions of workers were still left outside the law. On purpose. The Fair Labor Standards Act sounded universal, but the fine print said otherwise. Farm workers, domestic workers, many tipped workers and employees in some small workplaces were excluded from the federal minimum wage and overtime rules. Those exceptions were not random. In the year 1930s United States, farm and household labor were done disproportionately by black workers in the South and by women. Keeping them outside the law was the political price of getting powerful Southern politicians to support the New Deal. So even as one group of workers finally got a legal wage floor, another group, often poorer and darker-skinned, was left deliberately standing on bare ground. Later reforms filled in some gaps, but new workarounds appeared. Restaurant and hotel workers were covered, yet Congress created a special tipped minimum wage that let bosses pay them far less on the assumption customers would make up the difference. Decades later, that tipped minimum in the U.S. is still just a few dollars an hour in many places. A relic with roots in slavery, era ideas about service work, and who deserves a real wage. Even today, many farm workers still lack full protections, and gig workers and independent contractors sit in gray zones where employers insist they're not really employees at all. So when people talk about the minimum wage, they're really talking about a floor that was built with intentional holes in it, and those holes map pretty neatly onto race, gender, and class. So the floor exists, but it doesn't stay still. And that brings us to today. Because the question isn't just who paid then, it's who's still paying now. The federal minimum wage did not stay at 25 cents. Congress raised it repeatedly, and its real value, what it could actually buy, peaked around the late 1960s, worth roughly $10 to $13 an hour in today's money. After that peak, the line started to sag. Inflation kept eating away between raises. By the mid-2020, the federal minimum had been stuck at $7.25 for 15 years straight. Its buying power at one of the lowest points since the law was created, while rent and food kept climbing. Cities and states didn't all wait around. Dozens set higher local minimums. But in large parts of the country, the story is simple. Prices go up, productivity goes up, and the legal minimum trails further behind. That gap is the fuel for a new wave of fights. In 2012, about 200 fast food workers in New York City walked off the job demanding $15 an hour and a union. That strike launched the Fight for 15. Since then, cashiers, home care workers, warehouse pickers, and others have helped push dozens of cities, states, and big employers toward $15 or higher minimums, even while the federal number stays frozen. So the minimum wage is not a gift from the past. It's a line that was drawn, eroded, redrawn higher, and is still being fought over right now. Which brings us to the final question. Every time someone talks about raising the minimum wage, the same fear shows up. If wages go up, jobs will disappear, small businesses will die, and prices will explode. Some studies do find job losses when increases are very sharp. But most research over recent decades finds that typical minimum wage hikes have little or no effect on total employment, even in small businesses, while clearly raising earnings at the bottom. So if most people don't lose their jobs, who pays? Part of the cost is covered by slightly higher prices, your burger, your delivery, spread across all customers, instead of concentrated on the poorest workers. Part of it comes out of profits. Firms that relied on very low wages see their margins shrink. But the people who pay the highest price when the minimum stays low are the ones living on it. Full-time workers on today's federal minimum cannot afford rent, food, or transport anywhere in the country without help, which is why so many end up relying on public assistance even while working. In that sense, taxpayers are already subsidizing low wages. Public money quietly fills the gap between what employers pay and what it takes to stay alive. So when you hear the question, who pays for a higher minimum wage, there's a second question hiding underneath it. Who should pay the price of keeping wages low, workers and their families, or the rest of us through slightly higher prices and slightly lower profits? In 2012, a worker in Brooklyn looked at his payslip and decided that question had an answer. 2 weeks later, he and 200 others walked out of their shifts. That strike is still going, because the fight over how low your time is allowed to be priced didn't end in a sweatshop or a courtroom. It's happening right now. Every time someone clocks in for $7.25 and wonders how that's still legal. Who paid for your overtime?